July 3rd, 1899, 10 o'clock at night. Colorado Springs, Colorado. A wooden laboratory at the edge of town, far enough from the city that the ground doesn't interfere. Inside, a man alone with his instruments. Outside, a thunderstorm retreating east. He's been tracking it. The storm has moved more than 300 kilometers. By any calculation he knows, the electrical signals in his receiver should be fading. Should be nothing but noise by now. They're not fading. The receiver is still registering rhythmic oscillations, steady, clean, and repeating, long after the storm that caused them has moved beyond any reasonable transmission range. He leans closer. He adjusts the instrument. He checks it again. The earth is still ringing. After the storm is gone, he picks up a pen and writes in his notebook. No doubt whatever remained, I was observing stationary waves. His name is Nikola Tesla. The notebook is dated. The annotation is in his own handwriting. The notebook itself is now archived at the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade, and it was published, in full, in 1978, as Colorado Springs Notes, 1899 to 1900. I want to start there. Not with a theory, not with a claim, just with that moment, a man, a storm, an instrument that kept reading when it should have gone silent. Because what he wrote that night took mainstream science more than 60 years to confirm. And what he thought it meant. That's the question this video is actually about. I've been looking at this for a while now. Not with an agenda. I came to it the same way a lot of people do. Old photographs. The kind you find on digitized historical archive sites, state libraries, Shorpy.com if you know it. Photographs of American cities from the 1880s and 1890s. And something felt off. Not wrong, exactly. Just disproportionate. The streets in those photographs are muddy. Wooden sidewalks, horse-drawn carts, gas lamps. Infrastructure that you'd expect from a young industrial city still figuring itself out. But the buildings. The buildings look like they were dropped in from somewhere else entirely. Stone facades 5 stories high. Copper domes. Ornate metallic spires rising from courthouses and train stations and post offices in cities that, 3 decades earlier, were frontier towns. The engineering, the sheer material investment, doesn't match the roads underneath them. I noticed it. I started pulling threads, and those threads led me, eventually, to Tesla, to a patent filed in 1897, to a laboratory experiment in 1899, to a letter 8 words long that arrived in 1903, and to a question I haven't been able to fully answer. Was Tesla looking at something much older than himself? I want to walk you through the evidence carefully. I'm going to tell you what's verified, what's contested, what nobody has finished asking. Let's start with what we know for certain. On September 2nd, 1897, Nikola Tesla filed United States Patent Number 645,576 with the U.S. Patent Office. The title, System of Transmission of Electrical Energy. It was granted on March 20th, 1900. You can read it today, verbatim, in full, on Google Patents and the Internet Archive. I've linked both below. This isn't interpretation. This is a public document filed with the United States government. What does it describe? Tesla proposed transmitting electrical power, not communication signals, power, through a natural medium. Specifically, through the Earth's surface and the rarefied upper atmosphere, treating those 2 conducting layers as the outer and inner walls of a circuit. No wires connecting transmitter to receiver. No cable buried underground. The Earth itself completing the loop. To reach the upper conductive layer, the patent describes tethered balloons at 30,000 feet carrying elevated terminals into the atmosphere. The Earth below. The atmosphere above. Power flowing between them. I want you to sit with the date for a moment. 1897. The Earth ionosphere cavity. The conductive gap between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. The natural channel through which electrical energy can propagate. It wasn't formally characterized in physics until 1952. That's when a German physicist named Winfried Otto Schumann published the mathematical prediction of its resonant frequencies. The experimental confirmation of those resonances didn't happen until 1960 to 1963, when Balzer and Wagner measured them with modern instrumentation. Tesla filed a patent describing a transmission system that depends on the existence of this cavity in 1897, 53 years before Schumann's math, 63 years before experimental confirmation. I'm not claiming Tesla had secret knowledge. There are two explanations that sit within the normal range of scientific history. Either he made a staggering intuitive leap from incomplete evidence, which is documented to happen with great scientists, or he was observing something real in his experiments, something he could detect but not yet fully characterize. Neither explanation is tidy. Both are worth sitting with. But here's where it gets harder to dismiss. In 2007, a research team at MIT, Professor Marin Soljacic and colleagues, published a paper in Science magazine, peer-reviewed, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. The paper demonstrated wireless power transfer, 60 watts, across roughly 2 meters, at approximately 40% efficiency, using resonant electromagnetic coupling. The paper explicitly cited U.S. Patent 645,576. The MIT team described their work as a rediscovery of Tesla's resonant coupling principle. They weren't fringe researchers. They were MIT physicists publishing in Science, crediting a patent filed in 1897 saying he had the core concept right. Your phone's wireless charging pad, the charging pads in airports, the medical implants that charge through skin, all of them trace back to the same resonance principle Tesla filed in 1897. This is not a mystery. This is documented scientific history. What is still genuinely open, and I want to be precise about this, is whether the Earth's own resonant properties, the Schumann cavity, could be exploited for power transmission at planetary scale. Short-range resonant coupling, confirmed, commercialized. Global-scale wireless power. The physics are much harder. The mainstream scientific position is that it's not viable. But that gap, between what was confirmed and what Tesla believed was possible, is exactly where this story lives. Before I go further, if this kind of investigation is useful to you, the kind that actually checks the archive before making the claim, subscribe. This channel is building a series. It goes into places most history content won't touch, and it tries to be honest about what it finds. I'll be back in this archive. Subscribe there. Back to July 3rd, 1899. Tesla's observation that night wasn't accidental. He had built a specific instrument, a rotating coherer, a kind of receiver tuned for electrical signals. He was conducting systematic measurements during the storm. When the storm moved away and the signals continued, he did what any experimenter does. He checked the instrument, ruled out local interference, repeated it, then he wrote it down. No doubt whatever remained, I was observing stationary waves. Stationary waves, or standing waves as they're also called, are what happen when a wave bouncing around inside a bounded cavity begins to interfere with itself. The cavity creates a resonant pattern, stable, repeating, characteristic of the cavity's geometry. Tesla was proposing that the Earth itself is that cavity. I want to be honest about how that sounds in 1899. It sounds like a significant claim. The Earth as a resonant cavity, implying that electrical energy can propagate around the planet inside a natural waveguide, bouncing between the surface and the ionosphere, until it builds into a stable, detectable standing wave. In 1899, that had no theoretical basis in established physics. In 1994, engineers K.L. Coram and J.F. Coram presented a paper at the International Tesla Symposium in Colorado Springs, a peer-reviewed technical conference in which they reconstructed Tesla's experimental measurements from that night. The wavelengths he recorded, the frequencies he observed, and they compared those numbers to what Schumann later calculated for the Earth ionosphere resonance. They matched, not approximately. Closely enough that the Corams concluded Tesla had, with a primitive instrument in a wooden shack in 1899, measured what Schumann would later derive mathematically, and what Balser and Wagner would confirm experimentally 6 decades later. This is the thing that I keep coming back to. He was right about the phenomenon. Whether he was right about what it could do, that's the question no one has finished asking. And I think it's worth pausing on what Tesla himself believed he was looking at. He didn't describe the stationary waves as a curious scientific observation and move on. He described them as the foundation of a system, a global system. He immediately began planning the infrastructure to use them. He had already filed the patent. He had the theory. Now he had experimental evidence that the Earth was a resonant medium. What he needed next was a tower. In 1901, construction began on Wardenclyffe, Long Island, 60 miles east of Manhattan. The man funding it initially was J.P. Morgan. The tower itself was 187 feet tall. The dome at the top, 55 tons of copper. The underground system, and this is the part most people skip over, was not a simple foundation. Tesla sank iron rods and pipes 120 feet into the earth. His design documents describe a root system intended to establish direct electrical contact with the Earth's conducting layer. The above-ground structure was transmitting to the sky. The below-ground structure was grounding into the planet. The tower was designed to treat the Earth, the actual Earth, as part of the circuit. The architect was Stanford White, one of the most celebrated American architects of his era. The laboratory building he designed at Wardenclyffe is still standing. It's now registered on the New York State Register of Historic Places. You can visit it. The Tesla Science Center operates there. What you cannot visit, because it has never been fully excavated or mapped, is the underground root system. The iron pipes, the rods, the shafts sunk 120 feet into the Long Island bedrock. They're still there. Under a former industrial site, the only physical remnant of the only full-scale wireless power transmission experiment in recorded history. I find that detail unsettling in a way I can't entirely explain. Tesla was explicit in his correspondence with Stanford White. Wardenclyffe was the first of many. He envisioned a global network of at least 30 transmission towers, a planetary power system using the Earth itself as the medium. Any tower a receiver, any tower a transmitter. The grid, the planet. He built one. He built one, and then something happened. On July 3, 1903, exactly 4 years after his stationary waves discovery, Tesla wrote to J.P. Morgan. The letter is in the Morgan Library and Museum in New York. It has been catalogued, archived, studied. He pleaded, "Will you help me or let my great work, almost complete, go to pots?" Morgan's reply, dated July 14, 1903, was 8 words. "I should not feel disposed at present to make any further advances." 8 words. Project over. I want to be fair to the historical record here, because the community around this topic often isn't. J.P. Morgan pulled funding from Wardenclyffe because Tesla had misrepresented the project. Morgan had funded what he understood to be a radio communication system. Tesla, without authorization, had pivoted the project to a wireless power transmission system. This is documented in the Morgan Library correspondence. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was a venture capital dispute between a financier who felt deceived and a scientist who had changed scope without approval. The standard engineering critique is even blunter. Tesla's short-range demonstrations with a glowing bulb at 60 feet used near-field inductive coupling, which works but degrades rapidly with distance. Scaling it to planetary range is a different problem entirely, and the physics are genuinely brutal. The official explanation for why Wardenclyffe failed is wrong technology, wrong investor, wrong economics. Marconi's radio was already working and cheap. Tesla ran out of money after spending $200,000 on a $150,000 contract. And that explanation, I want to be honest, covers most of what we can document. It should be enough. It almost is. But here's the detail I can't clean up. The night Morgan's letter arrived, and for several nights following, Newspapers reported that Wardenclyffe Tower came alive. Visible electrical discharges arcing into the sky. Witnesses as far away as Connecticut. Tesla gave no public explanation. The tower never operated at that level again. The Tesla Science Center's own history of the tower does not account for those discharges. The Morgan Library correspondence contains no explanation. There is no document I've found that tells us what Tesla did in those final nights, or why. Whatever he was demonstrating or releasing, he did it alone, after midnight, with no audience on record. The tower was demolished in 1917, demolished for scrap, to satisfy a $20,000 debt to a hotel creditor. George Bolt, of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. A court order. The demolition was documented. The debt was real. The underground root system was left in the ground. The official explanation collapses here, not because of conspiracy, but because of proportion. The most ambitious wireless power experiment in history was destroyed to pay a hotel debt smaller than the cost of the copper dome alone. I've spent the first part of this video on what can be sourced: patents, laboratory notebooks, museum archives, MIT peer-reviewed journals. Now I want to ask a different kind of question. Tesla said he discovered stationary waves in the Earth in 1899. Mainstream science confirmed those waves in 1960, 61 years later. The question that leaves open, and I want you to notice that I'm framing this as a question, not a claim, is, what was Tesla hoping those waves could do? And is there any evidence that someone somewhere asked the same question before him? Because there's a community of researchers, amateur historians, pattern trackers, people who spend their nights in digitized archives the same way I do, who have been looking at that question for years, and their answer involves a name: Tartaria. Not a conspiracy, not a secret history being suppressed, a question about an absence. The argument goes like this: the global network Tesla envisioned, 30 towers, planetary resonance, Earth as the medium. Did he invent that system, or did he find evidence of it? And if something like it existed before the period we call the Industrial Revolution, what would that look like in the physical record? I'm not going to tell you the answer because I don't have it. Nobody does. There's no archaeological evidence for a pre-industrial global energy grid. But here's what I keep returning to. Go back to those photographs: 1880s, 1890s, state capitals, federal courthouses, Grand Central-style train stations, built in cities that 2 decades earlier were wilderness. Built by municipal governments, federal commissions, and private railroad capital, in countries that had no shared communication infrastructure. Built in a consistent architectural language: domes, copper spires, ornate stone, elevated metallic elements, that appears across continents in the same 50-year window. The community calls these buildings the grid, the receivers, the transmitters, the nodes of something older than what any history book accounts for. The mainstream explanation: Beaux-Arts architecture. A design movement originating in Paris that spread through pattern books, through architects trained in the same tradition, through the intentional adoption of a civic aesthetic meant to project permanence and authority. That explanation is real. It's documented. It accounts for the stylistic consistency. What it doesn't account for, and this is where I'm being careful, is the engineering excess. The copper-clad domes on county courthouses in Nebraska. The elaborate metallic spire work on train stations in cities that no longer exist. The material investment in elevated, conductive, geometrically precise architectural elements that were, officially, purely decorative. Why would you even decorate it like that if it wasn't functional? I've read that phrase in 100 comment sections. It doesn't prove anything. But the question keeps coming back because the architecture keeps prompting it. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Here's what I think is genuinely interesting, and what I haven't seen another video in this space actually do. The Tartaria community treats Tesla's connection to an older civilization as the conclusion, the reveal you build toward. But if you look at the timeline carefully, the connection runs the other direction. Tesla wasn't trying to build something new. He said repeatedly that he was working with discovered natural laws, the Earth's own resonance, laws that existed before he named them. He was trying to engineer with something that was already there. His 1899 notebook doesn't say, "I have invented a new phenomenon." It says, "I was observing stationary waves." Past tense, present condition, already existing. So the question the community is actually asking, beneath all the architectural photographs and the dome counting and the spire cataloging, is a simpler one. If the Earth has always been a resonant cavity, and if that property can be observed and potentially used, how long have humans known about it? Tesla found it in 1899. Schumann mathematically predicted it in 1952. The ionospheric science community confirmed it in 1960. Before 1899, nothing. No prior documented observation, no earlier patent, no earlier experiment. Or, and this is where the community's answer lives, before 1899, there was no need to patent it because it was already operating. He was right about the phenomenon. I keep coming back to that. Because if he was right about the phenomenon, the question of whether someone knew before him stops being absurd. I'm not saying that's true. The evidence for it doesn't exist in the conventional sense. But the more I look at what Tesla actually observed, the more I understand why the question keeps getting asked. What he was right about still hums at 7.83 Hz right now in the gap between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere, a number so specific that it has been measured, confirmed, published in peer-reviewed journals, and named the Schumann resonance. The Earth rings. That part is not a theory. I want to mention one more building, not as evidence of anything, just as a data point I can't get out of my head. The Singer Building, 149 Broadway, Manhattan, completed in 1908. At the time of its completion, it was the tallest building in the world, 612 feet, topped with a copper-clad dome and a lantern, one of the most celebrated works of American architecture in its era. It was demolished in 1968, intentionally, voluntarily, by its owners. At the time it was demolished, the Singer Building was structurally sound, architecturally landmarked by historians, and profitable. It was demolished anyway, making it the tallest building ever intentionally demolished in history. No comparable building of its era, structurally sound, commercially viable, architecturally significant, has been voluntarily demolished in the United States before or since. I'm not claiming the Singer Building was a Tartarian energy receiver. What the building was, according to every architect who has studied it, was a masterpiece of early skyscraper design that was torn down because its owners decided the land was worth more without it. That's the official explanation. It's probably correct. I just keep thinking about the copper dome, about the fact that the buildings from that era most likely to have elevated, conductive, architecturally anomalous elements at their peaks are also the ones most likely to have been demolished. And about the fact that the underground infrastructure at Wardenclyffe, the part of the experiment designed to make contact with the Earth's conducting layer, is still there, unmapped, below a parking lot in Shoreham, New York. I'm not going to tell you what picture these dots make. I've looked at them long enough that I have suspicions. I'm keeping them to myself because suspicions aren't evidence. But the dots are real. It's 1899. The storm is 300 kilometers east of Colorado Springs. The receiver is still signaling. Tesla writes it down. He doesn't know yet that he's looking at a phenomenon that won't be confirmed by the scientific establishment for 6 decades. He doesn't know that a patent he filed in 1897 will be cited by MIT researchers in 2007 as the conceptual foundation of a technology that now charges 1 billion smartphones a year. He doesn't know that the tower he hasn't built yet will be demolished for a hotel debt. He doesn't know that the question he's just observed will outlast everyone who tried to answer it. He writes, "No doubt whatever remained. I was observing stationary waves." That sentence is in an archive in Belgrade. You can see the original. The handwriting is his. The Earth was ringing in 1899. It's ringing right now, at 7.83 hertz, in the cavity between the ground under your feet and the ionosphere 60 miles above your head. That's not a theory. That's a measured, confirmed, published physical fact. What Tesla believed that ringing could do, what he thought it meant for how human civilization could be powered, connected, sustained without wires and meters and the infrastructure of control, that part remains unresolved. Whether he was looking at something much older than himself, I still don't know. But I'm less sure it's impossible than I was before I started. What I can tell you is, he was right about the phenomenon, and the gap between what he was right about and what he claimed to be possible with it, that gap hasn't closed. 60 years passed between his observation and the first confirmation. Another 65 years have passed since then. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Not the conspiracy, not the secret, just the gap itself. The space between what Tesla observed alone in that wooden building on a summer night and what any of us have done with it since. I don't have the answer. I'm not sure anyone does. But I keep coming back to Colorado Springs. July 3rd, 1899, 10 o'clock at night. The storm is gone. The Earth is still ringing.